All right. Again, if anyone has any audio video issues, feel free to message me and we will get going. But right now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and introduce everyone to SLLF President Steve Lakis. Steve is going to introduce Charlie. So Steve, I will let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Kate, and welcome all of you. It's good to be visiting with you in this virtual space. We've had an election, and there's an awful lot of conversation going on about that election, and we want to get right into it. I am very pleased to be able to introduce our good friend and somebody that hardly needs an introduction, Charlie Cook. We all know Charlie. I think all of us read the Cook political report, and we rely on him for his insights and his observations. And certainly this election will provide Charlie with enough information to delve into what happened during this election for months to come. But for our purposes, we're happy to have Charlie with us to share how he viewed this election, the trends that he has seen, and perhaps most importantly, what he thinks this means for the future. What can we expect in January when the Congress reconvenes with a new administration, with state legislatures grappling with all of the problems and issues that they're going to be confronting because of COVID and all of the turmoil that currently surrounds the United States. So without further ado, Charlie, I'd like to turn the mic over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. I always feel a little intimidated whenever I'm speaking before elected officials that, you guys actually do what I just talk about. And so I'm a little bit of intimidated or envious. But anyway, thank you all very much for having me on. And I was looking at the list of attendees, and I realized that the person that I've known the longest that I saw on this was Tony Anaya. We met in 1978, and he was Attorney General of New Mexico, so and running for the U.S. Senate. So anyway, it's nice to see, virtually see all of you. This was a wild election, and it reminded me of, remember some of you are familiar with the culinary delicacy of the turducken, where you take a deboned chicken and you shove it inside a deboned duck, and you shove that inside a deboned turkey. And I tried it, didn't care for it much, but a friend of mine had tried it. He didn't like it, but he said, there's just way too much going on there. And I kind of feel that way about this election. Boy, there was a lot going on. And I guess if I had to sum up the feelings that each party might have for Republicans, I'd say it was the old Winston Churchill line about there's nothing more exhilarating than having been shot at without result. And for Democrats, it's about snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. That there were some things that were expected and some things that weren't expected, and that I was really surprised about. The end result in terms of the presidential and just the basic outcome, I wasn't terribly surprised, because I always felt that President Trump was going to have a very difficult time getting reelected. That when it's an incumbent president running for reelection, it's a referendum. It's not a choice or a preference. It's a referendum. And that when you've averaged 38% Gallup job approval rating in your first year in office, 38%, the lowest of any elected president in post-World War II history. The previous record holder was Bill Clinton at 49. And then going up 2 points to 40% for your second year, and going up 2 more points to 42 for your third year, and averaging 41. That's those kinds of numbers don't generally get you reelected. I mean, we've known that, and again, I use Gallup primarily because you're the only ones who've been polling for the, basically the post-World War II era, that 5 presidents had had job approval ratings of 50% or higher. Eisenhower, Nixon, Clinton, Reagan, and Obama, and 2 had job approval ratings that were under 40, Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush. And you only had one that was in the twilight zone in between in the 40s, and that was George W. Bush. Remember, he had gone up to 90 and had stayed up there for a long time after 9/11, and then started coming down as the Iraq War started getting more and more difficult, and was at 48 approved, 49 disapproved in the last Gallup going into Election Day. And you remember that election, 2004, was awfully close. In fact, the morning exit polls, you might remember, were suggesting that John Kerry might win, and President Bush ended up getting reelected by about 2.5 points. But a 48, that's tough. And when your job approval ratings have been upside down or disapprovals over 50 since March of your first year in office, those are tough numbers, and those were tough before the pandemic, and the pandemic didn't make things any easier. So the actual outcome wasn't, and even the electoral college vote to me wasn't terribly surprising, because we kind of figured that the road for Biden was simple. It wasn't easy, but it was simple. That was going to be to hold on to Hillary Clinton's 20 states plus DC that had 232 electoral votes, so 38 short of the 270 you need. And then he needed to win the 3 states that Hillary Clinton lost by 0.8 of a point or less. Michigan, that was a 0.2 of a point, and Pennsylvania, that was 0.7, and Wisconsin was just under 0.8 of a point. And that would be 278. And there, of course, were the other 3 top battleground states that he didn't need to win, technically speaking, Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina. And then there were sort of the 4 extended battlefield kind of reach states of Georgia, Iowa, Ohio, and Texas. But just kind of holding the Hillary 20 and holding on to Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, that would have been good enough. And, he did that plus Arizona and Georgia and the 2nd District of Nebraska. Now, what was surprising, was the margin was a lot closer than we thought. It'll end up being at 4 points. I think Biden just got to 51% earlier today to 47.9, I think it was. But the margin nationally and the margin in some of these states were a lot closer than we thought. And, there's an automatic assumption that at the polls were actually, let me just say a couple other things. Then down ballot, that was to me was really, really, really surprising, because we had seen some absolutely concrete signs that there was a wave out there. There was a big wave. It was heading in. I think it's absolutely unmistakable that it was out there, that you had too much data. First of all, just quantitative data, regular traditional polls, too many polls from dozens of firms in each party and independent, on the congressional district basis, on the statewide basis. We were hearing from about some polling that was done on the state legislature for various state House, state Senate campaign committees in their targeted districts, that was all pointing in competitive districts, all pointing in the same place, that President Trump was in a really difficult situation, and it was looking like it was metastasizing, starting to hurt Republicans down ballot. And you had the polling data, you had focus groups that backed it up, and then you had just sort of basically the field reports, talking to people, political operatives in both parties that were showing, seeing signs in suburbs that this was going to be pretty ugly. And it kind of went down in 2 stages. It was, challenging for Republicans before, and then the June-July period was one big drop. And just sort of using it by just using the presidential polling as a metric, where Biden had been ahead by 4 to 6 points. So it was a steady Biden win, but it was still competitive, and President Trump was still in striking distance up till through the end of May. And then in June, July was when you start widening out to 8, 10, even 12 points. Then it kind of narrowed back down in the middle part of middle part of August, early September. It was 8 points going into that first debate on September 29th. And then that didn't go well for the president. Popped back out. You remember the first national poll that came out was NBC Wall Street Journal. It had Biden suddenly up by 14 points. And I thought, well, that can't be right. That sample's got to be too Democratic. And then CNN came in at 15 points. And then Fox News poll came in at 9 points among registered voters and 10 points among likely voters. And about the same time, I was starting to get reports back. In fact, the first conversations I had with partisan pollsters after this was from Republican pollsters who were saying, my God, this is, the bottom's fallen out. And then it settled down, narrowed down, and was basically 9 or 10, a couple of weeks out. And, we saw it in race after race after race. And then come election night, it didn't happen. It was like the dog that didn't bark. And one thing I've noticed, and it would be interesting to see when you look at analyses in your states and in your most competitive districts, but there was a drop off. If you take the Biden vote and the Democratic vote for the House of Representatives, just nationally, there was a 4 million vote gap between the Biden vote and the Democratic congressional. And on the other side, though, the gap was only like 1.7 million between Trump and President Trump and the House Republican vote. So there's going to be a drop off no matter what, but why would there be so much drop off on the Democratic side? And I am absolutely convinced that what was happening was this, that I think this election, it was by narrow, it was an anti-Trump. It was a defeat for President Trump, but it was not a Republican defeat. And in an election that looked like it was going to be a defeat for both of them. And I'm pretty convinced that when you looked at polling for the last year and a half, and when they would ask the question, notwithstanding who you're going to vote for, who do you think's going to win? And President Trump had a big old lead on that. I mean, basically the whole way through the campaign, there was an expectation that he was going to win, even among a lot of people that were going to be voting against him. But there was an expectation that he was going to win. And then when we started, it didn't start changing until the last week or so before the election. I think it started dawning on people that he might lose, or that he would lose, or would likely lose. And at that point, I think with undecided voters, I mean, the Trump base had always been there, 42% would just walk on hot coals for the guy. And then over here, you had, 45 to 50% that wouldn't vote for the president if he came up with a cure for both, personally came up with a cure for cancer and the coronavirus. They still wouldn't vote for him. And with this wee little bitty group in the middle. And I'm convinced that, the funny thing is, if you look at President Trump, at Biden's numbers, poll numbers, and you look at the vote, they match up almost exactly. In fact, nationally speaking, he was at basically 50-51 nationally in the polls, and he's going to end up at 51% in terms of the national vote. And that, but it was the Trump number that was under. And I know all the stuff about shy Trump voters, but what I think happened was this. I think the undecided vote basically entirely moved over, or almost entirely moved over for President Trump, mostly. And for Republicans down ballot, it basically did, in a lot of cases, just up and move over. I think that what you had was, you had a bunch, these undecideds were overwhelmingly independents. And I think they were willing, they'd given up on President Trump. They were going to vote against him, most of them. But I think they were willing to give Joe Biden the keys to the car, but they weren't willing to give him a full tank of gas and a credit card. That they were for replacing the president, but they weren't so sure about giving Democrats the keys to the kingdom. and that all this socialism talk that it had been building up during Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren's presidential candidacies, and the AOC and the squad and defunding police and all these things. I think the cumulative effect of that, once people started realizing that President Trump was probably going to lose, I think they started thinking, you know what? I'm not sure I want to give Democrats everything. And we just saw it was basically the equivalent of the undecided vote overwhelmingly breaking in the Republican direction. And as I said, it's like being shot at and missed. I'm pretty convinced that's happened, and we're seeing, starting to see more data, more things that seem to corroborate that. Because this wasn't my imagination. And when I've had a couple of people give me a hard time, I'll say, well, okay, let me bring out. I'm not going to burn any of our sources and stuff. People that share data with us off the record, I'm not going to do that. But I will say that take a look. Google these words: Ted Cruz, CNBC, bloodbath of Watergate proportion. And you'll see video of Senator Cruz on October 9th, I think it was, basically telling CNBC that this had the potential to be a bloodbath of Watergate proportion. The very next day, Ed Rollins told CNN that he thought that as far as he's concerned, the race may be over. The election may be over. That there were plenty of Republican pros that were seeing exactly what we were seeing. I just don't think we imagined this. But in terms of, and this was all the way up and down the ballot, and you saw it on the legislative level, where, in a lot of places, Republicans were bracing themselves for some pretty tough losses. Not everywhere, and certainly not in safe Republican districts, that sort of thing. And it varied a whole lot. This was more, the challenge seemed to be concentrated more in suburban areas and not so much at all in small town rural. But I think that it did vary a good bit from place to place, but it was very concentrated in suburban areas. But we were just seeing it across the board, and it was pretty amazing. Now, are there problems with polling? Of course, we knew that. Ever since the cell phone thing, that's not as big a problem as a lot of people think it is. Obviously, if you get somebody on the phone that's driving down the street, they're probably not going to, or they shouldn't consent through an interview. But good pollsters have been calling, have been doing, 70% of their samples to cell phones already. It was really more telemarketers wearing people out, and caller ID and voicemail. Back in a previous life, I worked for a polling firm, and back in the early '80s, we would get 100. You do 100 calls. Your phone bank would do 100 calls, and you get 25 completed interviews. Now it's you're lucky if you get 6%, and 4% is very, very common. But the saving grace for the longest time had been that the people that would answer the phone were not politically different from the people that wouldn't. For example, the example I like to use is my wife. If she sees a phone call and she doesn't recognize the number, she just won't answer it. And I always will, because the way I look at it is, if one of my kids is in an accident and bleeding in a ditch and a good Samaritan is calling me, I want to pick up the phone. And particularly now during the pandemic, when there's a lot of people, work calls from people from their cell phones at home, or cell phones not at the office, they're calls I need to get. But the political difference wasn't that great. So there's that, but I think there is, there was a lot of talk about the shy Trump voter. And to be honest, I think that was a little overstated in 2016. I think it does exist, and I think it existed more than we thought. than I thought anyway. But that didn't really explain 2016. That was more of an undersampling of non-college whites that got corrected pretty much in the polling in 2018. And when they started weighting whites by levels of educational attainment, that sort of fixed that. But I think there is a group of people that are simply not consenting to interviews. And it's not that they're lying to pollsters. I think they're either not picking up the phone or they're just not consenting to be interviewed. And I think that it is skewing towards a more working class, blue collar type of voter. And I think there is, that is going to be a challenge, and that for polling. But for the most part, I think this was undecideds breaking, and the numbers seem to match that. So where are we going with this? Obviously, the implications for redistricting, this is in your area, are enormous. That Democrats had hoped to score really, really big gains in 2018 on the gubernatorial and state legislative level, and they had gains, but it was very, very disappointing. And this one, with obviously 80% of state House districts up, this one was potentially really, really important. And it just, again, it was the dog that didn't bark. And so the implications for state legislative and congressional redistricting are huge, that this election turned out the way it did. I think both parties are facing have some homework to do. Democrats clearly, we've been seeing for 30, 40 years a trend among small town rural voters moving away from Democrats towards Republicans, and working class blue collar whites, specifically whites with less than a 4-year college degree, moving away from Democrats. And these were important parts of the Democratic the New Deal coalition even changing. And so I think that's something that has been there. We saw some little weakness there. A little bit of weakness, some weakness with Latinos. And that, now Latino voters have never been as monolithic as Democrat as African Americans, but we saw some deterioration there for Democrats between Hillary Clinton and Biden. And I think what I'm not clear about is, I think there are two things that I can kind of put a finger on, but I'm not sure the proportions. That one is that working class voters have challenges, economic challenges that transcend race, and that if you've got working blue collar voters, blue collar workers, that if you're seeing a problem with white blue collar voters, you know what? A lot of those challenges are probably affecting blue collar African Americans, blue collar Latinos. And you notice that among the gender gap that I had never really noticed till this year, that the gender gap existed very much both among African American voters between men and women, and in Latino voters between men and women, with the men obviously less democratic than the women are. And that seems to be getting more pronounced. So there's that element of it. And I think in Florida, and maybe a little bit some other places, but in Florida, it clearly was, I think that some of the socialist talk that we've been hearing, I think it started with Cuban American and Venezuelan Latinos that are from some Latin American countries. I think that sort of started getting them pretty nervous. And, I noticed that, the morning of the election, I had a long conversation with someone who was one of the top Biden people. And this person was confident about the overall outcome of the election, and felt good about Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, though obviously probably more confident than they probably should have been about Pennsylvania anyway, and felt good about Arizona, but said that they had a bad vibe about Florida. But I specifically asked them, why, just out of curiosity, why didn't Biden go down to South Florida and do a Russia Putin bashing speech and go taking on the president on that? And I got this kind of weird answer, that a non-answer answer. And it's something that I want to explore a little bit more, because it's like, why wouldn't, number one, if you're a Democrat, that'd be fun to do. But two, it actually could do them some good. And why did they? I mean, I can't imagine they didn't think about it. But what was the pushback? What was the reason not to do that? I'm kind of curious about that. But anyway, it was an interesting election, and one that Democrats, I think, have to be really demoralized over. Now, in the Senate, I think that this, right now, as you know, Republicans have 50 seats and Democrats have 48, or well, going in there was 53-47. But now, as of this moment, Republicans have 50 and Democrats have 48. So it's coming down to those 2 seats in Georgia. And as far as I'm concerned, Georgia is the most evenly divided state in the country. I mean, think about how close that governor's race was 2 years ago with Stacey Abrams, Brian Kemp. And then you look at the presidential race this year, it was 0.25 percentage point. Wow. And then you look at the Perdue Ossoff race, that Senate seat, where it was basically 49.7% for David Perdue, the elected Republican incumbent, and 48 basically for John Ossoff. And then you go to the other one and you add up, remember it was a jungle primary right together, and you add up the Republican vote, you add up the Democratic vote, and it was 49 something to 48 something. This is a state that is, I think it actually is the most evenly divided state in the country right this moment, which is astonishing considering, where it was not that long ago. And I don't know who's going to win these 2 seats on January 5th. My gut reaction, though, is that it probably won't split, that in all probability, either Republicans will win both of them, will hold both, I should say, which would take them up to 52, take them to 52 for a 1-seat net loss for the whole election, or the Democrats win both and the Senate goes 50-50 and Kamala Harris breaks the tie. But I don't think they're going to split. I mean, for a couple of reasons. Number one, we were seeing very, very little ticket splitting this year. You remember that in 2016, on the U.S. Senate level, that was the first election since we started the direct election of U.S. senators in 1914, that every single U.S. Senate race went exactly the same way that state was going that night in the presidential race. Well, this year in the Senate, putting the 2 Georgias aside, because we don't know what they're going to do, but Susan Collins in Maine was the only race in the country that went different directions in the U.S. Senate and the presidential, the only one. And she had to run over one of your colleagues, Sarah Gideon. She had to run a hell of a lot far ahead of President Trump to do that. But ended up doing it with a pretty good sized margin, actually, and one that. But anyway, I think you're going to see these. They're going to both go the same way, and the thing is, in this kind of environment, 2 things matter less than before. Number one is the identity of the candidates. The candidates matter less in these kinds of elections where people are voting in a more of a parliamentary way. They're either voting red or they're voting blue. And this looked like it was going to vote like, well, it ended up that way too, but this looked like it was like a classic midterm election. It looked like 1974, 1994, 2006, 2010, 2014, and at least in the U.S. House level, 2018. And the only presidential election really of my lifetime that was like this. Well, only two was 1964 Johnson Goldwater, and then the other was 1980 Reagan Carter. And in some ways, I think it was somewhat similar to 80 in the sense that that was a race that was too close to call, you remember, where there was an inclination to want to throw out President Carter, but there was some doubt. Was President Reagan, was Governor Reagan, was Ronald Reagan, this former movie actor, was he up to this? And it wasn't. They had real questions. Now, he had been governor of our largest state in the union for 2 terms, but the real question there, and it wasn't until they had that one debate the Tuesday before the election, and in that debate, Reagan did well, very well, and he cleared the threshold. And suddenly, it was like those undecided voters just picked up. They just stood up and moved over to the Republican side of the room. But they did that over 5 days. And I think that's I think that they had been leaning towards going Democratic top to bottom, punishing, the way they do with midterm elections, and then just got cold feet. It was like when a fish was about to go for a lure and something made them skittish at the last minute and they just didn't do it. So I think it was a fascinating election. And one last thing, and then turn it back to Steve and Tom for questions and comments. But I think we've been going through this period of partisanship that nothing like we've ever seen before, and you think back to when George H.W. Bush was president. I'm sure he had an enemy somewhere. I couldn't name one, but you just didn't have that level of animosity. And yeah, he lost re-election, but there was not a lot of animosity out there towards him. But when Bill Clinton was elected president, you saw what had been, in modern times anyway, an unprecedented level of Republican animosity towards Clinton. And then when George W. Bush was elected, you had it went to an even higher level and this was Democratic animosity towards President Bush. And then when President Obama comes in, Republican, and it's sort of these increasing levels of excessive partisanship, of animosity, and this term that Alan Abramowitz from Emory University calls negative partisanship, of people that hate the other party more than they even like their own party. And I saw some interesting polling data the other day of I want to say it was in the 70% of Republicans who think the Democratic Party is being taken over by socialists, and a like number of Democrats who thought that the Republican Party was being taken over by racists. And this isn't what it used to be like. I mean, not at all. So we've been going through this period of increasing levels of partisanship that you would have thought that a pandemic, a national crisis of this kind that would seem to be apolitical, and yet it's become politicized. So, wow, look at this. But on the Washington level, I think that we may actually go through a, sadly, probably brief, period of a little bit less partisanship for a couple of reasons. Number one, and Democrats are very surprised that, Nancy Pelosi and House Democrats, their margin, I mean, now that they've had, it's what, 8-seat loss now in the House, their margin, it's not much in the U.S. House at all. And any kind of ideological agenda that Democrats would try to push in the House, it's going nowhere. I mean, it just can't go anywhere. And conversely, let's assume for a half second that Republicans will have 52 or 51 seats and a majority in the Senate. Anything that the more conservative elements of the Republican Party want to push through, that's not going anywhere. So that the only thing that does happen, I think, are going to be coalitions built from the center. But the other thing has to do with relationships, and it's interesting if you think about the last 60 years, from 1960 through 1976. Look at who you had in the White House. You had first John Kennedy, a former member of the U.S. House, former senator. Then you had Lyndon Johnson, a former House staffer, House member, senator, Senate Majority Leader, followed by Richard Nixon, who was a former House member, former senator, then vice president, followed by Gerald Ford, a former, a House member, House minority. He was in the leadership for it was a long time, working his way up to House Minority Leader and then Vice President briefly before he became president. But basically, so it's not just experience, and it's not just understanding the process, understanding the institutions, understanding the way things work there, but it's also the relationships. And that from 76 forward, then you had you had Ronald Reagan for 8 years, who had been governor of California, but he didn't have relationships in Washington to speak of outside the conservative movement. And after, and I'm going to skip over George H.W. Bush. Then you went to Bill Clinton, who had been governor of Arkansas, but he had never, other than an internship on the Hill, he had never worked in Washington, certainly never served in Congress. He didn't have a lot of those kinds of relationships. Then after that, George W. Bush, well, he had neither. And after Bush, Obama, who, he had been in the state Senate in Illinois, but he had been in the U.S. Senate for only 4 years, but 2 of those years he was running for president full time. So he basically wasn't there and was kind of aloof anyway, didn't have a lot of relationships on the Hill. And then Donald Trump didn't either. And so really since 1976, the only person that was sort of comparable was George H.W. Bush, who had been a member of the House, CIA director, UN ambassador, the equivalent of ambassador to China, RNC chair, then vice president, that had sort of the relationships and things. Now, what I'm getting at is Joe Biden comes to the Senate in 1972 at the age of 30. He had been in the place for 12 years before Mitch McConnell was elected in 1984. Then they served for 24 years together in the Senate, and from all accounts got along pretty well. And then as vice president, to the extent that anybody at a high level in the Obama White House had any relationship at all with McConnell, it was Biden. And they used to call him the McConnell Whisperer. And that they had this back channel that came in pretty handy from time to time. And it and just sort of 2 little weird data points, 3. One, and I know you could overplay things like this, but the fact that McConnell was the only Republican senator at Beau Biden's funeral in Wilmington was Mitch McConnell. Interesting. And if you look on C-SPAN, and you could find the McConnell sort of farewell speech when Biden was leaving as president of the Senate in 2008, and listen to his voice catching, and you can kind of see some tears in his eyes. And it was clearly there was a relationship there. Or the other C-SPAN thing that was of Biden as vice president going down to Louisville, to the University of Louisville, and speaking at the Mitch McConnell Center at the University of Louisville, and watching sort of the back and forth in this, that I think, number one, no ideological or partisan agenda, I think, can work. But number two, these are 2 guys towards the end of their careers, and I think they're going to want to try to do something. And so I'm sort of my wife calls me a pathologically optimistic person. I'm sort of temporarily optimistic that maybe we will be getting But yet I realize that right now with the president's not failure to concede, and that there's this kabuki dance going on, and McConnell's got to do what he's got to do. But I kind of think something may happen there, and I'm kind of hopeful. Now, I'm not Pollyannish, and I don't think there's any signs that the electorate is getting mellower or less partisan. But I think that we may have a unique situation that would not exist if either party had real control of the apparatus on either side. And I also just think that Biden is a pretty pragmatic, institutional guy, pretty gregarious guy, and that his style is just not one that would go for the really confrontational stuff. So anyway, so that's sort of my reaction to it. I'm curious what other people are thinking, but wow, what an election. So it was kind of a weird mixture of the expected and the unexpected, with a lot more unexpected than I thought. But that's what keeps this business interesting. So,
thank you, Charlie.
Tom?
I've got several questions that have already come up, so let me just jump right in here. From Representative Brian Pat Kennedy, I wanted to know sort of about the polling, and you talked about that some people weren't answering the polls. I think that his question has to do with the public maybe losing faith in the polls and not answering. How are the pollsters going to address that if the public begins to, I know your argument is that they weren't that far off, but that's not the public perception.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
how are we going to deal with if the public begins to lose faith in the polling?
No, I think that's a very good one. Yeah, no, I mean, there's no question that as far, the perception in 2016 was, well, the polls said Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. Well, actually not. That I think a lot of people missed civics on the day they talked about the Electoral College, and that's actually and that what we didn't realize in 2016 was that linkage between the popular vote and Electoral College that was never precise, but generally worked the same way, but came unhinged in 2016. With Hillary Clinton winning, California by 4.3 million votes, New York by 1.7, Illinois by 950,000. And that Republican votes are more efficiently allocated. But anyway, the point though is that that linkage isn't nearly as close as it once was. But there is certainly a sense that the polling, and I think there were problems with the polling, but I don't think nearly what the public perception is. And I think that's absolutely true here. I mean, that's the thing, is when you look, the vast majority of the polls I've seen, they nailed the Biden number. It's just what happened to the undecideds. And, what I've started telling, normal people, you guys are pros and in the business, but is that, pollsters are not mind readers, and polls are not crystal balls, and they can't tell you what an undecided voter is going to do. And yeah, they can stay home, or they could vote for third-party candidates or write-ins, or they could skip over, they could split down the middle, or they can break. And we have seen them break in disproportionate numbers one way or the other. But that doesn't get to Speaker Kennedy's question of how do polls, I think one thing, sadly, one thing might be you have to just wait the hell out of it to take the polls to what you do know. What were the results? And weighting various groups to try to compensate for underrepresentation of certain kinds of people. And demographically, you could tell to a certain extent. But even just to, and one of the problems of waiting to, well, what did they say they voted for, who they voted for last time, and wait, is that people, a lot of times they tend to over-report voting for the winner or not voting for the losing candidate. They see some of that. So no, it's going to be, it is going to be a real challenge. And, but we knew that polls were having a challenge. But the thing is, I think part of it is poll problems, but I think a whole lot of it is people misinterpreting, thinking that the polls were worse than they really were. And but I don't have an answer for that. And it's something that I'm going to be answering. I suggest all of you ask your pollsters, how do you do that? And I mean, I don't know what the answer is going to be.
Right.
We'll see.
Great.
That's a
All
good
right,
odd numbered year column for me to write.
there you go. Got several questions revolving around the transition, and sort of I guess one is, when do you think that the transition is going to begin to take place? Another one building off of that is, do you think that President Trump is he going to concede, or when will he concede? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any inside information.
No crystal ball on that one. Nobody does.
Yeah. I mean, my guess isn't any better than yours. A lot of yours, and probably a lot worse. But I see. The thing is that to me, there are a lot of things that you can jump on President Trump for. But when I heard Democrats complaining about him not conceding and not on the Sunday afternoon when the election was just called on a Saturday morning, it was like, hey, give the guy a little space. I mean, I don't think anybody ever expected that President Trump would be a good loser if he lost, but give him a little bit of space. And I don't think this is terribly hard. I mean, I wouldn't want this to go on for more than a few more days. But let's face it, you've got a guy coming in, a new president coming in who knows the job inside and out, and his people know inside and out. So this, along with, I'd say, George H.W. Bush, is the most an administration that least needs a transition, or needs less of a transition than if somebody had never served in government at all before, like President Trump had, or somebody that had been a state level official, a governor or something, who was sort of new to this town and all of that. I certainly think that Biden ought to be getting his national security briefings and all this, but I don't think it's gonna. I don't think President Trump is ever gonna, concede in any traditional way, but. I don't think it's going to go on for a whole lot longer. And I also think that the pressure of Georgia, that they're working on it. I think Republicans have to walk on eggshells here, because on the one hand, they don't want to disillusion their base, but because they need them on January 5th. But on the other hand, the president's hurting his brand by this, and would be of less value, I think, because of this in Georgia. So I don't know. I think it can't go on for a whole lot. I don't think it will go on for a whole lot longer.
Casey Beckert, speaker in Colorado, raised the concern about the impact of some of this with the president challenging the integrity of the electoral process and other things. You think that's damaging our democracy? I'll give you an easy question.
Yeah, well, no, this isn't good. And I mean, I'll say internally and externally. Internally, in the sense that I think that there are a lot of people that are so cynical about politics and about the process to begin with, and overly cynical, that this is not helpful at all. And I think that when you see various secretaries of state, for example, stepping forward, Republican secretaries of state, who are saying, no, look, this went fine. And I think it's actually a miracle. No, I don't think it's a miracle. I think a lot of the warnings, a lot of the Cassandras that this is going to be completely screwed up, this election. I was using, before the election, I was using an example of that maybe this would be like Y2K, where you had people that were going to say the sky was going to fall when we went from 1999 to 2000 at midnight.
Right.
And that, it wasn't going to be just supercomputers, but your toaster wouldn't work. And guess what? It was a nothing burger. Well, one reason it wasn't a nothing burger is that people were warned and they took steps to mitigate it. And I think that was done. And I think that state and local election officials did a hell of a job of keeping this from being a big problem, and in terms of the integrity of the process. And I've this whole thing. I mean, hell, I'm from Louisiana. I don't think vote stealing, voter fraud is a significant problem in this country. Not at all. I mean, I think we get probably better, better administered elections than we pay for. I mean, God knows we spend so little on the administration of elections that, it's for a lot of counties, it's down there with, jail food. And down on the priority list there. So, we don't pay for precision. But yeah, no, it's not helpful. But I think externally abroad, I mean, that's where we are, our brand as the American democratic process, we've taken a real hit around the world. And I think that's a lot of what Putin was trying to do, was try to diminish the brand of democracy and our mantle of leadership. And they don't want people in other countries to look up to us. And I think they've been fairly successful at that, and we've helped them in that. So yeah, no, I think this is very, very, very destructive. But and I think that's going to be as if President-elect Biden didn't have a full-time job with fighting the coronavirus and getting the economy back on its footsteps. I think basically reassuring our allies and rebuilding alliances that had been in place for 75 years. I think that's that'd be a full-time job too. So no, I think this is not helpful, and I think that people taking partisan shots. And the thing is, and it's to be fair on the other side, where I think there are some elected officials that have taken steps to make it more difficult for some people that are legitimate people that want to vote, make it more difficult for them to vote. But I think that some of the criticism, I think on that side goes a little too far to make it look like that even more is being done to prevent people from voting. So I think there's a lot of erosion in the public confidence, more than is deserved, and I think this is a problem, and it's something I think hurts everybody in the process. And I think the media, to be honest, is responsible for a fair share of it, for playing up a lot of these things, these conflicts that maybe don't necessarily deserve quite as much attention as they're getting.
I had a question from Neff Garcia, one of our corporate folks. And he would, now I've got to pull it back up here. You mentioned the COVID virus, and we know there seemed to be quite a bit of partisan difference on the approach to it. How do you think that affected down ballot?
It doesn't seem to have had much of an effect. And the ironic thing here is that if you say the outcome in the US Senate was going to be somewhere between 50-50 and 52 Republican, if someone told you that a year and a half ago or 2 years ago today, that would have been very surprising. If someone told you that the House, that Republicans would end up picking up, 10 or so seats in the US House, you would have said, yeah, that's basically in line with what people were thinking, and probably in the legislatures as well from them. And the thing is, the predictions from 2 years ago were better than the ones from 2 weeks before the election. How's that for interesting? And from before the coronavirus. But I forgot where I was going with this. I know. I have a friend, Dave Marsden, who's a state senator in Fairfax County, Virginia, that we were talking one time, and we were talking about sort of different, not just different ideologies, but sort of different value structures in terms of priorities between the parties. And Dave was saying, yeah, I mean, think about the last line in the Pledge of Allegiance, with liberty and justice for all, and that we all believe in liberty and justice. But he said Republicans and conservatives put a greater value on liberty, on self-reliance, on independence, on going as far as your talents can take you. And conversely, Democrats and liberals put on justice, on fairness, on leveling the playing field. They put a much greater priority on that. And so while we all both believe in both, that and that plays out to me in the coronavirus of should you have mask mandates or not? And this fits right in there. And should you shut down businesses? Should you, how to reopen or close down the economy? What you do, it's yes, there is partisan conflict, but it also just reflects different points of view.
Do you think that had any impact on?
Made up.
Do you think that had any impact on the down ballot?
I don't think so. I think in the end it didn't.
I got another question here from Senator Chuck Winder in Idaho. What do you think? What are your thoughts on how the national media handled the polling? Did they? You've talked about, but did they oversell it?
Yeah, I think they oversimplify it, and I think we don't. I think they should emphasize. Okay, how many? To me, when I was looking at towards the end, when I was looking at the presidential numbers, I was looking specifically at the Biden number. And is it above or below 50%? And is the margin within 2 points? In other words, if knowing that a Democrat probably has to be ahead by 2 or 3 points, is the top one over 50 or not? But yeah, no, I think they do. But I think more broadly, I think the media has heard. I've got a chapter in a book that's coming out in the essay the LSU Press is doing on the media in the era of Trump. And the essence of what I wrote was that I think the news media has damaged themselves irreparably in that they've changed the rules of what can and can't be said in news stories and have lost all credibility with a very large segment of the electorate of Americans. And that, when I took journalism in high school at Captain Shreve High School in Shreveport, Louisiana, we were taught who, what, when, where. And you didn't do why, and you were very careful about how. And you just stuck to the 4 W's. And if a public figure was saying something that wasn't true, you would quote that figure, and then you would turn and quote authoritative sources, but you never said it was a lie. You never said it was false. You never said it was untrue, that you only did that on the opinion page. And I think that as a way of compensating for, dealing with, in their minds, President Trump breaking norms, they felt like they had to take steps. And I think they've irreparably damaged the profession, and that it manifested itself in people basically no longer believing in any kind of non or less ideological media. And so, you're not going to think that the coronavirus is very bad if any news source you're watching or listening to is not really playing it up much or is downplaying it. And, personally, I've become a big fan of watching. I watch very, very little cable, cable news. But watching, just the 30-minute broadcasts, there are nights that I watch all 3 of them. I watch one live, the one that my son is a producer for at ABC News in their Denver. He's half of their Denver bureau. And I have a contract with NBC, and I used to have a contract with CBS. I just kind of rotate among or watch 2 or 3 of them in a night because I want to see what 30-something million people are seeing, because it's like the only common thread that we have in our society left. And that way too many people, a trusted source of news is somebody that is going to tell them what they want to hear. And but I think journalism has hurt, and I'm not coming at this from a partisan standpoint at all. But as a journalist, I think I think journalists have hurt themselves very, very badly. And I sometimes think that journalists are the least self-aware people on the planet.
Well, with that, Charlie, I will say somebody said they can't wait for your book to come out. So when's that going to be?
I've never written a book.
Oh, you were talking about the I'm sorry, the chapter. You
Oh,
said
the chapter.
in the book.
Oh, I think it's early next year. It's LSU Press. And they've got, I think it's 15 or 20 essays from various people. And I think my essay will probably be the turd in the punch bowl. The one that
I doubt that, my friend.
Well, it's the Manship School of Mass Communications at LSU. I'm on their board of visitors, and I suspect it will not be that there will be some people that are not going to be happy with it. But you know, what the hell? When you're towards the end of a career, you got
a lot of freedom.
Yeah, you can start stepping out a little bit. Anyway, but listen, I've loved being associated with the State Legislative Leaders Foundation and traveling, visiting you guys around the country and around the world. And there's nothing more fun than hanging out with the people that are the product of a peer review process of political leaders that are picked not by they're picked first by voters, but picked by their members. And I just think that's huge. And I looked at the list and saw all kinds of friends there, and I get in trouble if I start signaling anything out. But I will say, Hertzberg, I hope you're still on the call. So anyway, see you guys later.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Tom.
I appreciate it, my friend. I'm gonna turn it back over to Steve.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Charlie, Steve, turn your mic on, buddy. There you go.
With our crowd, your book is the chapter in that book is destined to be a bestseller with us. Thanks for doing that, Charlie. I feel better already after listening to you, especially in your prognostication that you think that the Congress will be able to find some common ground with the new Biden administration. I think all of us, regardless of party or philosophy, are looking forward to that. It's extraordinary. We've been doing these Zoom meetings since March, and we will continue holding various Zoom meetings and webinars with legislative leaders and members of our advisory council and guests until such time when the all clear whistle blows. Our sense is that will be sometime in the middle of next year when we'll be able to resume our get-togethers in person. And Charlie, you'll be first on our list when we make that exotic trip, either left or right, to some foreign country to start to restore America's stature with the rest of the world.
Well, thank you. Thank all of you for what you do. I know sometimes you may not get like you're getting a lot of love, but thank you all. So take care. Bye.
Yeah.
See you, Tom. Bye, Kate.
Thanks, guys.